the book that I'll be taking this from, has a number of things in it that I could talk about, but I wanted to think about or present today some of the ways in which short-term mission, I see it as influencing the ways that we understand mission, and how some of this is a good thing, that there's cautionary things that we want to be aware of with short-term mission, but there's also things about it that I think we can say are good about what's going on in the world today. So just to outline my talk, I'll just give a little bit of background to this research and how I came to this project, a little bit about short-term mission and some of the history and the context that we're talking about, and then this question of short-term mission as mission, and whether or not this how we understand this as a part of mission generally, and then finally to talk a little bit about how short-term mission can support a holistic theology of mission. So, okay, let's start with how this work came to be. As an anthropologist, I decided I needed to work among the natives being my students, so I went to their natural habitat there. And I was particularly interested because my students were talking about these trips that they had taken to all places that tourists do not go: northern Ghana, outer Mongolia, rural South Africa. And they were talking about these trips, but not just the trips themselves, but they were talking about what they did, and it was clearly short-term mission, and talking about them in ways that were very common regardless of where they went in the world. It was very clear to me that there was something that was happening in terms of how they were learning information, how they were engaging these places that was common, and they were getting that narrative from someplace. The idea of narrative, I won't say too much about that tonight, just sort of theoretically, but the idea that we all have narratives, we all have certain stories that we use to make sense of the world. We all have ways in which we translate experiences that we have in the world into things that we say that are important, and these are the narratives that we use to understand ourselves and others. So I wanted to find a trip that I could join to find out how this narrative was in fact constructed, how it worked out on the mission field when people were traveling, and then how it served to shape the ways that they talked about these trips when they came back. So I wanted to find something that was fairly typical, and I knew that most trips, just from some of the background reading that I had done as well as my own experience with students, were going to Spanish-speaking countries. I felt like the language issues were going to be significant. So I looked around for a trip. I found a trip that was going to the Dominican Republic, and I connected with a church in the area so that I could find a team that I could do this research. There is a variety of experiences that short-term mission teams have. I didn't want something that was particularly cringeworthy, some sort of short-term mission horror story of people who just go in and do something awful. Nor did I want something that was super innovative and super unusual that most people wouldn't be able to identify with. So I was looking for a trip of high school students who would be going and doing perhaps construction, vacation Bible school, mostly white Americans. And I was in the evangelical network, so I decided to work with the evangelicals, even though these are certainly happening with Catholics, with mainline Protestants, with Orthodox. There's a variety of organizations that are doing short-term mission. So, found a church in town. Was not hard to find a church. They were very gracious. They welcomed me in, and I joined them in order to understand what it was that was going on and how people really thought about these things. I did spend one summer prior to my trip in the Dominican Republic with my family, with my adorable and cute family. This was in 2005, so that little girl is now getting ready to go to college, and that little tiny boy is now in 5th grade. My wife and I are still just exactly the same. We have changed not one bit. But we spent some time there to kind of see what the site was like. And then the next summer, I went through the preparation with this team. So this is ethnographic method, right? To be with people, hear them day in and day out, and understand the world from their point of view. So I joined right in. I went through the interview process. I spent time in the preparation phase with our team that went to the Dominican Republic in the 9 months before we went. Went with them basically as an adult leader while I was there, for the 13 days we were in the Dominican Republic. When we came back, of course, we had our opportunities to do the slideshows, the PowerPoint presentations, talked to the rest of the church, had a little bonfire kind of thing over at one person's house where we exchanged pictures, and then about 6 to 8 months later, re-interviewed each person to find out how they had thought about and processed the trip. So all of this is coming from about 2006, 2005-06 is the year that the work was conducted. From that came the book, Short-Term Mission, Ethnography of Christian Travel, Narrative, and Experience. And I originally thought about doing this just as a sort of ethnographic study, but as I talked to people, it was very clear that Christians were most interested in this, that Christians were the ones who really wanted to understand what was happening on these trips, what were some of the effects, and then particularly how we as Christians and we as the church might actually respond to some of these findings. So I decided to publish it with InterVarsity Press rather than a university press, and come up with a book that is something, a kind of a mishmash of anthropology, missiology, the practical, and the theoretical. Tonight I'll be focusing more on the missiological aspects of the work. I'm happy to talk with anybody who's studying anthropology or looking into some of the more theoretical issues, how I worked with all of that. But I figured the missiological would be the stuff that would be most helpful tonight, and then some of the practical stuff we'll get to at the end. So let me just give a little background to short-term mission and the phenomenon, the movement itself, so we understand what it is that we're talking about. Short-term mission has grown immensely in the past decade and a half, past 15 years. These data here are taken just from Protestant mission agencies. So these are the agencies that send long-term missionaries out, so like your team or Send International or the various agencies that are associated with denominations in many cases. You can see the blue are the long-term missionaries and the green are the short-term missionaries. The blue has stayed fairly constant from 96, 98, 99, and 2001, whereas the short-term missionaries has absolutely exploded. So you see a little over 300,000 there, what they call short-term missionaries. That is a very low number for the total number of short-term missionaries because, of course, total number of short-term missionaries includes a lot of you all in this room who went with churches or went with programs here at your university or other places that weren't sponsored through these mission organizations. But this just gives a brief hint of the kind of growth that we're talking about. It might seem like short-term missions has been around, probably for you, for your whole lives. But in fact, this is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. And even more than that, the way that we talk about these trips, we know that these trips are, for many, the first time that they encounter the world that's different than the one that they grew up in. We know that for many people, this is where they actually learn about people who are different than themselves. So this was and we often come back with the narrative of, it was life-changing. I will never be the same. So I was very curious what that actually meant when people said that they had been changed. Of course, short-term mission is also somewhat controversial. There's no question that for some who are in long-term missions, especially when this first started to become a big phenomenon, they were asking the question of, is this good? Should we be encouraging this at all? Should we be calling this mission? Or should we be calling it Christian tourism? Or fun travel that people get other people to pay for? Or something else, that is generally not really complimentary. The debate about short-term missions really took off in the 1990s, but one of the fun things in my research was a chance to go back through archives and really look at how this emerged in language as people talked about mission. And you could go back further than the 50s, but the 50s is where, post-World War II, you had a lot of people coming back on the GI Bill, going into college, very motivated to engage the world that they had just come from. So you had a lot of young men who had been overseas for the first time fighting in World War II, either in the Pacific or in Europe, and they came back really motivated to go back to those places and see the gospel spread. About the same time, of course, you had the energy rising for things like the Peace Corps, which was founded in 1960 by President Kennedy. So in the 50s, you've got student pre-trips, kind of pre-Peace Corps. In the 60s, a lot of the mission organizations start experimenting with sending young people out for 2 years, for 6 months, as a kind of journeyman or a kind of get ready to be a long-term missionary kind of stuff. In the 70s is when you start getting parachurch groups. So actually in 1970 is when Teen Mania International was founded. with its kind of unfortunate acronym of TMI. But anyway, that was founded in 1970. 1970, you see a growth of these. In the 1980s is when the church-based ones really start to take off. And for the church that I was studying, it was actually in 1986, right in the middle of the decade, when they founded their own short-term mission program. And then the 1990s, they grow exponentially until, and it's so interesting, I don't know why it all happened right on the decades, but right in the year 2000, short-term mission shows up on the cover of several key mission publications, Frontiers Missions and Evangelical Missiology Quarterly. Put short-term missions on their covers. Now, what's happening now? I don't know. I'm hoping, and I was encouraging some of your faculty and administrators today to continue to encourage you all to engage in the research that we need to understand short-term missions in the future, because I'm convinced that there is still greater things going on, greater changes that are happening now. But this was the background for what short-term missions was doing. And so it was in the 90s that you started to see people asking some hard questions. In 1992, there was an exchange between two mission practitioners practitioners. Leslie Pelt was a long-term missionary who published in the Evangelical Missiological Quarterly a very critical article on short-term missions. And you can see that she says you simply can't accomplish what missionaries need to accomplish in 2-week or 2-year missions. So she was putting 2-year into the short-term category, which I think today we wouldn't even do that. On the other side was a guy named Seth Barnes who founded Adventures in Missions, which is still a very active organization. And he was saying, no, this is what's happening, and we need to get on board with this. That the short-term missionary movement is perhaps the most powerful force mobilizing new missionaries today. But he also made a statement in that same article, which I think was extremely telling. The changes are forcing a redefinition of our concept of a missionary. And in fact, I think even then it was starting to force a redefinition of the concept of mission and what mission was. Now, I'm not arguing that short-term mission was the only influence that was causing some of these redefinitions. But I do think that this was part and parcel of a redefinition that was going on in the 90s and has continued into the present. I saw this most clearly, interestingly, this is how anthropological research works. Everything is data. Every single thing you ever see and hear is data. And so I was taking my kids actually to a VBS in town at a different church, had nothing to do with my research, but during the VBS, they had all the kids together in their big room there where, they're saying, goodbye to them at the end of the day. And they had up on the wall a big piece of butcher paper that said something like Missions Project, Missions Project, I think is what it said. And the woman who was dismissing the kids, she says, okay, I want to talk about the mission project. Our mission project is to help restock the food pantry. And she starts talking about bringing canned goods in and restocking the food pantry. And it was a very interesting moment because just prior to talking about the mission project, she was talking to all the kids in the room, and the room was about, this is in Wheaton, which is a pretty white, pretty middle-class town, but the diversity is primarily recent immigrants and refugees who've been resettled in our town. And right next to this church was a big apartment building that had a lot of these families, and this church, very much to its credit, had gone over there and let people know about it and gotten a lot of the kids to come. And so this room of 80 to 150 something, I don't know, I'm very bad at estimating numbers, but anyway, there was a bunch of kids in there, and about half of them were not white. They were clearly from the families that were living next door to the church. So she's talking to all this group of kids. As soon as she gets to the mission project, she says, this mission project will serve families who struggle to feed themselves and who have needs. And so unlike our families, we really need to serve and do this mission project for them. And I thought, well, that is very interesting, because I have a feeling a lot of the families in this room actually are ones that take advantage of the food pantry that you all are going to be stocking. But it was in that moment that she shifted from this idea of all of us together to us serving them. And mission became this giving, and what one Native American missiologist called plight-based ministry, where now it's something that we need to do to meet a need. And I thought this is indicative, I think, of what is also wrapped up in the idea of short-term mission. That it's mission because we're going to a place that has needs, and we're going to meet those needs. That's what makes it mission. So something that we might have called humanitarian work, or we might have called charity in the past, now is being called mission. And I think that this is wrapped up with how we think about what it is that we can do on these 2-week trips when we travel to usually poor countries or to places that we perceive there being at least a spiritual, if not a physical, need that we can meet. As Seth Barnes noted in '92, the growth and participation of short-term mission necessitated a redefinition of missionary, and combined with this widespread participation in short-term mission, it seems to have brought about a wider range of activities, particularly related to practical and service-oriented activities. Now, I'm not arguing that this is a bad thing. In fact, I think this is actually has the potential to be something quite good because it actually can push the idea of mission into a kind of more holistic theology of mission, away from a bifurcation of a kind of evangelistic mandate and a cultural mandate, is the way that this is often framed, into understanding mission as something that should be lived out in the world, that should have practical implications for our life. This theology of mission that I know, you talk about in classes and mission classes here, can be taken from a variety of sources. Several graduate programs here and undergraduate, here at ACU that are working with mission and mission theology would emphasize, I'm sure, this idea of mission as being a holistic enterprise, as something that should go beyond evangelism and proclamation, should include that, but then should also include the kind of humanitarian or the kind of physical help that seems to be wrapped up so strongly in the idea of mission today. So, David Bosch is a well-known mission theologian that you may have run across in some of your classes, who would encourage us to think about mission not in terms of simply evangelism, though that is part of it, but in terms of the missio Dei, in terms of God's mission in the world, that this is how we should think about mission. In fact, other theologians who are not necessarily considered theologians of mission, such as systematic theologian Kevin Van Hooser, also puts the missio Dei at the center of what he thinks it is that we should be doing as the church. So this seems to me to be a good move, a good thing that could be coming out of short-term mission, that we are beginning to think about mission in fairly holistic terms. And in fact, in the book, I talk about how the narrative of mission typically has been drawn from something like Matthew 28, the go and make disciples verse. That's been a motivating verse for a lot of missionaries for generations and generations. But in fact, in some ways, this new theology of mission, or this expanded theology of mission, draws more on something like Micah 6:8. The idea that our entire lives are wrapped up in mission, that the missio Dei is more than just the travel or the opportunities that we have to go elsewhere, but in fact, it's how we live day to day. I recently had a conversation with the dean at Fuller Seminary in their School of Intercultural Studies, and he had some concerns about this. He felt like in some ways we have actually gone too far into mission as humanitarian work, and we have lost some of the evangelistic mandate or some of the evangelistic impulse that has been part of mission for so long. And I think that that's absolutely a danger of the ways in which we can see mission getting redefined. But I think the potential is a positive one that we could lean into, in which we think about these two things coming together, and the idea that short-term mission might be promoting this idea of the missio Dei as something that is inclusive of proclamation, evangelism, social help, humanitarian work, the physical needs that are being met through the work of mission. As I talked with the dean at Fuller, it struck me that, okay, then maybe I need to think a little more about the theology and the ways in which Scripture can be brought into our understanding of this theology. And I was immediately drawn to Luke 4, where Jesus proclaims his mission in the world. And this aspect of, in fact, there is also a political dimension to mission. And this is another potential that I think is part of short-term mission. In the debate on the validity of short-term mission, we can recognize that one of the effects of short-term mission from North America to largely poor non-English speaking countries has been an expansion of the idea of mission from merely evangelism into more practical humanitarian areas. The narrative of personal transformation and relational help, however, has not enabled a greater understanding of political and social conditions creating some of the economic and social deprivation that these trips often seek to address in the name of mission. So while I think the potential is there for this broader understanding of mission, I think we need to recognize the ways in which that isn't necessarily happening unless we are thinking rather specifically and rather analytically about what it is that's going on. So, thinking about things that short-term mission can provide and things that do happen in the context of short-term mission, ways that they are impacting mission and mission work today. Sociologically speaking, one of the benefits of short-term mission is the way in which they provide what's known as linking capital. Social capital, which is a kind of overarching concept here, is the idea of things that you have, your sort of your cultural knowledge, your social standing in the world, that you can use to get stuff done. So if you are a particularly wealthy person, even though you might not need money to get something done, the fact that people know that you're wealthy might cause them to respond to you in a certain way. Have you ever noticed that it's wealthy people who get all the free stuff in the world? That's their social capital that's taking root there, that's actually enabling them to get stuff done. One kind of social capital is what's known as linking capital. Linking capital is when you are able to create relationships with more powerful people in order to get stuff done. Short-term missions often provide linking capital for people in other countries who then gain access to more powerful networks through the visits of short-term missions. We had an example of this recently in my own life. Pastor James, this is Pastor James from Bangladesh, and he stayed with us for a week just because a woman in our church knew him, and he was coming through town, needed a place to stay, so he stayed with us. Lovely guy, really enjoyed getting to know him. His trip to the United States was actually paid for by a church in the East Coast who had sent a short-term mission team to Bangladesh. He'd gotten to know them. They flew him to the United States to visit with his mother, who lived in New York City, but then also to travel around the United States connecting with other churches. So he was able to turn this relationship through short-term missions into a much larger connection with churches in the United States. And Bangladesh, you may know, has a very small Christian minority. They have very few political and economic rights, and they're often discriminated against. And so this was an important way for him to connect beyond Bangladesh. So in thinking about how we can be more faithful witnesses in the world, we can recognize the benefit to our brothers and sisters of building these links, how they can, building these links and seeing how this travel, with all its expense and resource use, can be enabling greater faithfulness in them and in us. And it can lead then to this more holistic understanding of mission. And when we're aware of the ways in which this is happening, it can help us redefine an understanding of what mission is, what can fall under that category. But we also need to be aware of the danger of linking capital, or at least the danger of these relationships, or the perils that are involved in it. First, at the interpersonal level, we often fail to understand how these trips reflect a lack of awareness on the part of travelers about the inequalities that are involved. So here's a quotation from a Latin American leader who emphasizes the importance of linking capital for his church. But at the same time, another Latin American leader points out that they need to be able to have the power to control these trips. That simply having these groups come is not necessarily a benefit in and of themselves. These trips can have the effect of blinding travelers, those of us who go on the trips, to various political and social realities, actually making it more difficult for us to see and explore certain topics that we're hoping to understand when we travel. So when we travel, typically, we want to understand the culture of the country that we're going to. We want to understand the causes of poverty. But the narratives that we travel with and the understanding of mission that we travel with may in fact be inhibiting our ability to understand these very things. The concepts that I'm drawing on, you can see really clearly in the work of a couple sociologists who I think make this point really well. Christian Smith and Michael Emerson wrote this book in 2000, and it's not about short-term mission at all, but it is about the ways in which certain groups in our society understand structure and power, and ways in which our cultural context can inhibit us from understanding these things. This particular book, I'll just quickly summarize, it's about black church and white church in the United States, and how, in spite of the common theology that these two groups share, if you ask theological questions of black Christians and white Christians, you're going to get very similar answers. But if you ask political questions, you're going to get very different answers. The black church is much more likely to vote Democrat, the white church much more likely to vote Republican. Why would these two theologies lead to such different understandings about the world? They argue it has to do with the ways in which white Christians in particular fail to see structure. Michael Emerson, in another point, another writing that he does, talks about the cultural toolkit of individualism, anti-structuralism, and relationalism, which is characteristic means by which white Americans interpret the world. This is very closely related to the personalistic narrative of short-term mission. If you think about how we talk about these trips, the friends that we got to know, the Facebook profile pictures that we put up of the sweet little brown kid that we got to know and with our arm around, and this is really beautiful. Those very personalistic narratives inhibit our ability to understand the larger issues at work. So as we're thinking about the ways in which short-term mission is impacting our understanding of mission, the category of mission, and what mission is, we need to be aware of the ways in which our narrative of short-term mission is limiting our understanding. Short-term mission travelers in my research were left without opportunity, motivation, or language to get to the political, cultural, and social context to which they traveled. So while there is this positive benefit in short-term mission to see mission in a more holistic way, at the same time, without an awareness of the kinds of inhibitions that this narrative is putting on us, we're left without some language to understand what it is that we're seeing. So let me talk about what the implications are. What can we do about some of the blind spots and also some of the opportunities that come about as a result of short-term mission? I have a number of suggestions in the book. And this wasn't originally the purpose that I had for the book, to make suggestions about short-term mission. It's certainly not a how-to manual. But I do think that anytime you start to study something, anytime you start to really investigate something, as a Christian, you want to think about, how would this help us follow Christ more closely? How will this help us in the work of the church? So first, I suggest that the demands of the larger Missio Dei, the larger purposes of God in the world, place demands on us to make learning about the cultural, educational, and political context of the place we go part of the mission experience. So if you've ever been in the position of perhaps planning a short-term mission trip, likely you have thought of, okay, we have a project to accomplish. We have a building to make. We have a painting project to finish. We have a vacation Bible school to conduct. And these are the projects that are meant to be done. And then we'll have beach day at the end. We will have maybe a rafting trip in the middle. That's what our group did. We might build in time for shopping. We might build in time for touring a few historic sites, but we wouldn't think of those as part of the mission. But if we allow the short-term mission impulse to push us towards a more holistic understanding of mission, we should see those as part of the mission. This is part of what I was saying in the class the other day. Who was in my class the other day? Emily, you were in the class the other day. That the mission of God is to reconcile humans to himself and humans to one another. And to the extent that short-term missions has helped us to see these aspects of helping one another, of connecting with one another as part of mission, this is good. To the extent, though, that we don't take it further than that, I think we're limited. So we should see touring a museum, visiting with local leadership, even visiting the beach as part of the mission that we are on as the people of God. if you think about that, how would that change the way that you go to the beach? This was one interesting aspect of my own research. So this group of teenagers that I was with, we had our mission experience. We did our thing, right? We built our second floor of a center that we did. Last day, we go to the beach. It was a great visit to the beach, and these teenagers were fine. They didn't get all, ugly American or horrible or anything at the last day, but they clearly switched. They clearly switched from a mode of short-term missionary to the mode of tourist. You all know how to be a tourist, right? You all know what that means. You all know how to go into the marketplace, and it's like, oh, this is a bargaining culture, and so you bargain real hard, and you start to, I'm going to get this price really low, and then you walk away with your great deal. They transformed themselves, just unconsciously into the culture of tourism. But I would argue that had they considered this part of their mission, they might have thought differently about what it means to barter with the people in the marketplace, what it is that they were shopping for and how they were shopping. Maybe they would have thought differently about whether they should wear the two-piece bathing suit or not. Maybe they would have thought differently about which resort we should go to. The all-inclusive resort owned by Iberostar in which the money is flying back to Spain, or the locally owned resort where the money is actually staying in the country. So part of what can be done in pushing this definition of mission further is to think of the ways in which interacting, even commercially and economically, in the context can be part of our witness. Second, I would argue that short-term mission should lead to long-term relationship with possibility of exchange, mutual accountability, trust, and responsibility between leaders. I think this is happening more and more. As I said, I think that short-term mission now from the 2000s is entering into another phase where people are beginning to be aware of some of the problems with these sort of strike force missions where people drop in and they come out. But I think we need to do more of this where we're developing long-term relationships with people in other contexts. And they are actually coming here to mission here in ways that we have been going and missioning there. There was one of your faculty members, I think it was Dr. Morgan, asked me to talk about an episode in the book where there was a meeting that I sat in on, and the short-term mission leadership board of this church were talking about bringing a team from, or welcoming a team from Costa Rica. They had been to this school in Costa Rica, helped them with their spiritual emphasis week. Now the students from that school were going to come to Wheaton. And this was actually the second time they were coming, 2 years before they had come. And what the agenda had been for them was to go into the high schools and hang out in the Spanish classes and go with the high school students and sort of see what American high school is like. Well, you can imagine. They're on their break from school in Costa Rica. They fly all the way to the United States and they spend their day in school. This was not their most favorite thing. So they had one day where they were actually working in childcare in the ESL program in the church, and that's what they really loved. They wanted to do more of that. They said, could we go to a soup kitchen? Can we do more childcare? Is there any construction that we can do there in Wheaton, Illinois? And for about 20 minutes, the board talked about this, and they said, we don't need to have them do that. We've got that all covered. We don't want them to see the ugly sides of Wheaton. We want them to see what's nice about our town. We don't want them to have to work while they're here. We want them to be able to relax. And they had this conversation right until about 20 minutes in, and when one of the women said, I wonder if this is how they talk when we get ready to go there. Of course, I'm just writing all this down thinking, oh, this is fantastic. This is really, really interesting. Anthropology gold. But I think the very fact that they were welcoming people from the countries that they had visited opened their eyes to things that they would not have seen were they not doing that. So I think these kinds of relationships that go back and forth are going to be very helpful in the future in both sides learning to understand the other. There's dangers in partnership, and every situation would have to be worked out in context and in light of the very particular things that are going on. But I do think that that's a possible way to mitigate some of the dangers of short-term mission. Finally, the purpose of these trips needs to be redefined from a short, powerful spiritual experience to one that's meant to have lasting influence on both sides. The narrative of short-term mission has traditionally been, I went there and it just changed my life. I went there to be served, and I was served. They were so poor, but they were so content. They were so happy. It just changed my life. And it becomes a kind of powerful, like a retreat or like a pilgrimage, where you go and you have this powerful spiritual experience. I think we need to redefine them from that into something that will have lasting influence on both sides, both in terms of the material consequences, like the story of the woman who talked about how this is something that we're doing to share resources, as well as in terms of knowledge, education, and spiritual growth. This is ways in which we are being taught what it means to be Christians in the world as we participate in these trips. How do we make these changes? Well, I think partly it needs to be done structurally. Joanne Van Ingen is a long-term missionary serving in Honduras who is also co-leader of the Calvin College Honduras study program. And her argument is that it has a lot to do with resources and the ways in which resources are inequitably distributed. So spend at least as much money supporting the projects you visit as you spend on the trip, and then turn this money over to locally based and presumably indigenously staffed organizations engaged in the sort of programs and projects the short-term mission team wants to support. Because she would argue that without a sharing of resources, there will not be a sharing of control. Bishop Zach Niringiye from Uganda, he talked about what he would like to see in short-term mission. It's very simple: come be with us with no agenda other than to be with us. Now, Dr. Janine Morgan, when we were talking at lunch today, she said, this is a very interesting suggestion. How would this work? How would you show up in a place and say, we're just here to listen? In fact, I think this would have to be something that would have to be mutually agreed upon, of course, on both sides. It's not something that, again, the visitor would just mandate. Oh, no, we're just here to listen. Oh, yes, I know you want us to do something, but we refuse. We're just listening. That could be, every bit as sort of colonializing as coming in and saying, well, this is what we're going to accomplish whether you like it or not. But I do think there's something very powerful in the idea of these travels and these missions being about connection and understanding as much as they are about accomplishing stuff. So I argue that embracing a theology of mission that is holistic and as wide a scope as possible is being pushed forward from short-term mission. That in short-term mission, there is an impulse, there is a sort of latent potential to see mission as more than just church planting and evangelism, or just social service and humanitarianism. That both of these are wrapped up in there, as well as the possibility of understanding the political and economic structures that support the inequalities and the injustice that we witness so often as we travel. But it's only going to happen, this larger understanding is only going to happen as we are very self-consciously aware of our understanding of mission and of the effects of these trips on our lives. So I hope that some of you as undergraduates or as graduate students are thinking about ways in which you might be able to put your education to use in doing some research on short-term missions and understanding these more deeply, in reflecting more deeply on what it is that you're doing as you travel, how it is that you're relating to the context, and what it is that's coming out of it, as well as what your understanding of mission is and where that has come from, and how that has been manifest in your life. By viewing short-term mission as part of the Missio Dei, we understand how these trips fit into a much wider frame of mission, and I think potentially make us much more faithful members of Jesus' church. I'm interested to hear what questions you have had and what experiences you've had with short-term mission and interact with those. I hope something that I've said will stick and will be something that you can think with as you go forward in your classes. I think Dr. Flanders is going to lead us in some Q&A.
Well, I'm not going to lead, but I do have a microphone, and I'm interested to know if some of us have some questions. Raise your hand, and we'll run the mic to you. And we can't leave until we have at least 3 questions. So you're not going anywhere. Are you loud, or do you need the mic?
I can be loud.
Hey, you're good.
All right.
All right.
You said that you would not describe your book as how-to manual. How would you describe your book?
Okay, so I'm going to repeat for the recording. The question was, Brian, you described your book not a how-to manual. How would you describe your book?
I would describe it as a research project. When I first started looking at short-term mission, I wanted to do what any academic would do, which is read up on this, right? What have other people written about this stuff? And I found that there was very little written on it. There was only, and this was in 2004, 2003, 2004. There was very little written on short-term mission. Sorry, let me qualify that. There was very little research on short-term mission. There was quite a bit written on it. Starting in the 1990s, there's a lot written on short-term mission, but not much research, not much social science, either quantitative or qualitative, that had been done on short-term mission. So I really wanted to do some research and get some data together to find out what's going on. And there's lots of forms of research. The kind I do is ethnographic. There's statistical research. There's experimental research design. But I wanted to do this research and then analyze the data to just understand what's really going on. I was sharing this story at lunch today. I had a very nice morning at my hotel. It was lovely. Had a long time before lunch. So I went to the workout room, which I rarely do, but I did. And I watched The View. I'm not proud of this, but I did. Okay, and if you've seen The View, you know that there's this little shtick that they do where they get some pop news thing, they get some study that's in the press or something, and then they all talk about it. The thing that they threw out there was a study by a sociologist that said the long-term effects for babies who are fed with formula are not statistically different than babies who are fed with breast milk. This was their study. Now, a couple of the women, I think Whoopi, thought this was great because she said, great, this is going to make women feel less guilty. I promise this is going to come back to your question, I promise. She says it's going to make women feel less guilty. That's great if they have to use the bottle. Others said, they started arguing against it. The first thing that one of the women said is, well, I just refuse to believe anything that says breast milk is bad, anything that God has made is bad. If she says that, I just refuse to believe it. Well, of course, that's not what the study said at all. The study said there's no statistical difference on whatever thing she measured, between children who are bottle-fed and children who are breastfed. It's not saying breast milk is bad. But that was where she went right away. And then Barbara Walters came in with something like, well, my experience as an adoptive mother, and she shared a story. And immediately it turned from interacting with this article into stories that people had. And this is what I think too often we do, is that we don't know how to deal with research, and we rely solely on experience. And we need better data on stuff. We need more research, and we need lots of people like you who are in college who are learning how to think analytically about experiences in the world, including our spiritual experiences. Thinking analytically about what it is that we're walking away with when we have a short-term mission high shouldn't be a discouraging thing that makes us think, oh, it's fake because I can think about it. It should make us actually very excited that there's something quite deep here that we can analyze. So whether it's studying scripture or whether it's studying something like short-term mission, I wanted to do some analysis. I wanted to do some research on it. But I didn't want to leave it with that. I felt like it was important to put something in there that was a kind of like, okay, what are the implications of this research? So that's chapters 9 and 10, a few little bullet points of like things that you might do with this research. But it is primarily about researching what happened, getting data, presenting that, and then hopefully inspiring some others to do research in the future.
I saw a hand right over here somewhere. Yeah, go ahead.
You said that short-term missions should put just as much money into the actual mission area as it would take to go there and to do missionary work. But given that most missions trips, especially ones overseas, are quite expensive, how would you recommend that students do that?
So the question was, I think coming off of one of your quotes, the suggestion that you bring as much money as you spend on the mission as sort of a donation or a gift to give to organizations locally. And your question was, given that these short-term mission trips are pretty expensive often, a lot of money, how would you do that? What would that look like? Is that correct? Okay.
Great, thanks. That was a suggestion from Joanne Van Ingen, who's a person who's been long-term missionary in Honduras for decades now. And I think what she really wants to point out is that we need to be very conscious of the ways in which the imbalance of resources shapes the encounter that we have when we travel. my luxury as an academic is I just get to raise all sorts of questions and issues and then throw them out onto you all who have to do something about them. So I can't answer the question, in the sort of abstract, because you're right, some of these trips cost upward, if you're taking a group of 15, 20 people, it can cost you $45,000 to do your trip. To raise another $45,000 that you would then leave behind is a fairly daunting task. That would be quite a thing to do. But one of the things that I ran across in my research was a great case study that a guy wrote up about a kind of a project in the UK where some big suburban megachurches outside of London wanted to do short-term missions in the inner city of London. And so they coordinated with some inner city churches or some urban churches in London. Well, the urban churches were uniformly small, relatively under-resourced congregations. And then there were these great big congregations in the suburbs that were raising $2.5, $3 million to bring their groups in and have like Christian carnivals and events and all sorts of great stuff. The urban churches, though they were much smaller and much less resourced, they realized they needed to control this. They needed to push back on these big churches, or these big churches were just going to steamroll them and come in and do some crazy thing that was going to make a big mess that then these urban churches were going to have to clean up. That they were probably going to just really upset the work that they were doing rather than really contributing to it. Well, fortunately, they're all in the same country. These urban churches were able to work with the suburban churches to shape the plans in such a way that it ended up having a fairly beneficial effect. They were pretty happy with I think it was called Christ in the City event that they put on. But that's within the same country, speaking the same language. The real issue to overcome was the resource imbalance. So think about that magnified really quite a lot when North American groups travel to a place like the Dominican Republic or Tanzania or wherever it is that we go, where the groups there feel very little freedom to tell a visiting group, this is what we need you to do. This is what we need you to not do. This is what we need you to do. This is how this needs to go. This is how we want you to use your money. This is where we want you to stay. That's a very difficult thing for them to do. So I think what Joanne Van Ingen is really getting at is we need to be very conscious of the ways in which our superior resources make us very difficult partners. It's very difficult for these groups to work with us when we are very rich and they are very poor. And so one way to do that might be thinking about how do we even out those resources. And it might be taking the money that we have to do the trip and giving it to them and saying, use this money to host us. And whatever you don't spend, you get to keep, or something like that, which means you're probably going to be eating rice and beans the whole time. But that might not be a bad thing. Yeah.
Maybe one more question. Okay, way in the back. Can you be loud enough that we can hear you?
I can try.
Go for it.
Well done.
Are you aware of the effects of global overpopulation and the effects of missionary work on that?
The effects of missionary work on global overpopulation. Interesting. Overpopulation is an interesting idea because, of course, what we really mean is sort of under-resourced peoples. If you think about the world today, Africa is actually a fairly underpopulated country. At least it's not a very densely populated continent. Sorry, I didn't mean country. Ugh, please. Oh, I hate that. Ugh, can't believe I did that. I'm so embarrassed. Africa is a relatively low-density continent. Certain countries like India, of course, are fairly highly, very densely populated. Bangladesh is extremely densely populated. But it's not the number of people, it's the way that resources are distributed that is more problematic at the moment than population in and of itself. Can you share with me what you mean by missionaries contributing to various resource allocation problems?
Well, there's a current statistic out right now that within the next 100 years, our globe, I'm talking about globally, not continent, we are going to be out of resources for food and transport, and that. And so if we, not to sound heartless, but if we help everybody else flourish, that just contributes more so.
Well, it's absolutely true. You're absolutely right that currently the United States is living in a very unsustainable way. If every person in the world tried to live like a US American, tried to eat our diet, tried to travel like us, tried to have homes the size that we do, use as much energy as we do, we would need 7 Earths to sustain the population of the current Earth. So there's no question that in many ways, things are going to have to change in the ways that we consume resources. Technology helps with a lot of that. Technology helps us conserve energy. Technology helps us produce food in more efficient ways and so forth. But I would certainly say that as Christians, I can't see any way that following the gospel would allow us to say the problem is with the poor rather than the problem is with the rich. So I would argue that as short-term missionaries, one of the things that we have the opportunity to do is to understand the ways in which the current distribution of resources is highly inequitable. And the current political system contributes to that. And we need to be aware of ways in which our participation in that may be pretty problematic from a Christian point of view. So I would hope that as we travel and as we connect with Christians in other places, as we learn about the problems that they're facing, we would also learn from them some of the solutions that would help us to be more faithful in our efforts to see God's work happen in the world, to see shalom, peace, connectedness, human flourishing happen for everyone.
I want to thank you all. I think our time is up. And let's give Brian Howell a big thank you.